The neon haze of the intergalactic trade hub, Zyphos 9, pulsed like a living beast, its underbelly writhing with shadowy figures and whispered deals. This was the kind of place where lives were bought and sold, where desperation fueled an economy of suffering. Commander Kael Voss moved through the market with calculated steps, his dark tactical suit blending into the dimly lit alleys. He wasn't here for trade. He was here for a rescue. His eyes locked onto the central auction stage, where a shimmering containment field held an exotic captive, a woman unlike any he had ever seen. She stood with regal defiance, her iridescent violet skin glowing softly under the artificial lights. Her silver-white hair cascaded down her back, moving as if caught in a gentle current. But it was her eyes that stopped Kael in his tracks. Deep, luminous pools of gold that reflected pain, fury, and something else. A silent plea for salvation. A Sylvarii. Kael's heart clenched. The Sylvarii were a near-extinct species, hunted and sold like rare gems. Their genetics were highly sought after, for breeding, for experiments, for power. And she was the most prized specimen he had ever seen. 50 million credits! A bloated Draxian slaver cackled, slamming his thick fingers on the bid console. Other bidders snarled and growled, each one eager to claim their prize. Kael didn't have time to wait. He moved swiftly, pressing a small detonator onto the power console of the containment field. With a silent countdown, he took position. 3, 2, 1, boom. The lights cut out. Chaos erupted. Screams filled the air as the containment field fizzled, its energy barrier momentarily collapsing. Kael leaped onto the stage, his pulse, rifle humming to life. A single shot sent the nearest guard sprawling, while a second round pierced the auctioneer's mechanical security drone, dropping it in a shower of sparks. The Sylvarii woman's golden eyes locked onto his. A moment of hesitation, suspicion, then understanding. "Come with me if you want to live," Kael growled, extending his gloved hand. For a heartbeat, she didn't move. Then, with a sharp intake of breath, she grabbed his hand. Kael pulled her close, shielding her body as another plasma bolt sizzled past. More guards poured into the hall, weapons drawn. The slavers wouldn't give up their prize so easily. "Hold on," he muttered. With a flick of his wrist, Kael activated the escape beacon. The device on his belt let out a shrill pulse, locking onto his ship, the Revenant, docked just outside the market. A calculated surge of energy wrapped around them, the teleportation sequence pulling them out of the fray in a flash of blue light. The world twisted. For a fraction of a second, reality fragmented. Then silence. They landed inside the Revenant's loading bay, the hum of the ship's engines a comforting contrast to the madness they'd just escaped. Kael released the Sylvarii's wrist, stepping back. She stared at him, her expression unreadable. Her body, though graceful and ethereal, was tense, coiled like a predator, assessing whether to flee or attack. "You're safe now," Kael said, his voice firm but calm. Her golden eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" "Commander Kael Voss. I just saved your life." "Saved me?" A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "You don't understand what you've done." Kael frowned. "I understand perfectly. I just pulled you out of a hellhole where they were going to sell you to the highest bidder. You think that's the worst of it?" She shook her head. "I am Sylvarii. Do you know what that means? The moment they realize I'm missing, they will hunt us. They will never stop." Kael had heard the stories. The Sylvarii weren't just a rare species, they were genetically imprinted. Their biology bound them to their mates in a way no other race did. That was why they were so valuable. If someone wanted to claim one, they had to ensure no one else ever could. And that's exactly what Kael had done. He reached into his pocket, fingers brushing against the small control pad on his wristband. He had already taken precautions, a device implanted the moment she materialized on his ship, a microscopic biochip embedded beneath her skin, a safeguard, one that ensured no other being in the universe could ever claim her. She belonged to him now, and she didn't even know it. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken tension. The Sylvarii woman, Kael didn't even know her name yet, stood rigid, her golden eyes scanning the ship's interior like a caged predator assessing an unfamiliar environment. Kael exhaled slowly, keeping his posture relaxed. He had seen this kind of fear before, not the kind that screamed or begged, but the kind that coiled beneath the skin, preparing to strike at any moment. "You're safe here," he said again, softer this time. Her jaw clenched. "Safe?" The word dripped with something dangerously close to mockery. "There is no safe place for me." Kael took a step forward, careful not to startle her. "Then let's start with a name. Mine's Kael. And you?" Her lips parted as if she was about to answer, but then she hesitated. Her hands balled into fists, and for a moment, Kael thought she wouldn't tell him. Then at last she spoke. "Zyara." It suited her, sharp and exotic, with a hidden strength beneath the surface. "Zyara," he repeated, nodding. "Good. Now you want to tell me who exactly is after you?" She let out a bitter sigh and moved away from him, her silver-white hair cascading down her back as she turned. "You already know, don't you? The moment I was put on that stage, my fate was sealed. The highest bidder would have owned me, and the moment I was bonded, there would be no escaping." Kael knew exactly what she meant. The Sylvarii weren't just rare, they were genetically coded to imprint on a single mate for life. Once that happened, their physiology ensured absolute devotion. That was why warlords and slavers hunted them so aggressively. Zyara took a slow, shaky breath. "You don't understand what you've taken on. My captors will hunt me to the ends of the galaxy, and when they realize I've vanished, they won't. Just come for me." Her golden eyes met his, burning with intensity. "They'll come for you too." Kael's lips curled into a smirk. "They can try." Zyara studied him, as if unsure whether to admire his confidence or be annoyed by it. Kael walked toward the ship's control panel and tapped a sequence of buttons. A digital interface sprang to life, showing various signals across the sector. The Revenant was already cloaked, its location masked from potential pursuers. "We're off the grid," he assured her. "No one's tracking us." Zyara shook her head. "You don't get it, do you? They don't need to track us. They just need to find the highest probability. And if they realize I'm with a human, they'll assume you've already—" She faltered, her gaze shifting to the floor. Kael narrowed his eyes. "Already what?" Her lips pressed into a thin line, and then she muttered, "Bonded me." Something hot and electric rippled between them. For a moment, Kael couldn't look away from her. Her luminous golden eyes, her tense shoulders, the way she seemed terrified of what she was saying. The truth of her words settled deep in his chest. He had already changed her fate. He had made sure no one else would ever touch her, and she didn't even know it. Zyara exhaled sharply and crossed her arms over her chest. "Listen, Kael. I appreciate the rescue, but you don't know what you've done. If we don't find a way to erase my genetic signature from their scanners, they'll track me. They'll figure out I've bonded, and then they'll come after whoever has me." Kael hesitated. This was where he would normally tell her the truth. That she didn't have to worry. That he had already made it impossible for anyone to take her. But something in the way she looked at him, so raw, so distrustful, made him bite back the words. She wasn't ready for the truth yet. Instead, he said, "Then we'll find a way to erase it." Zyara looked at him, surprise flashing across her face. "You'd do that? Why wouldn't I?" "Because no one does something for nothing." Her voice was edged with suspicion. "What do you really want from me, Kael?" The words hit harder than they should have. What did he want from her? Nothing. Everything. He had saved her because he couldn't stand the thought of her being owned by someone else. But there was something more now. Something deeper. A pull he couldn't explain, as if the moment he touched her hand, something changed inside him too. But instead of answering, Kael simply said, "I don't do things for payment, Zyara. Not like that." She studied him for a long moment, then turned away. "We'll see." Kael clenched his jaw. He wasn't sure what frustrated him more. That she still didn't trust him, or that she had every right not to. She didn't know it yet, but he had already marked her in a way no one else ever could. And when she found out, he wasn't sure if she'd hate him for it, or if she'd accept the bond that was already growing between them. Zyara didn't sleep that night. She sat near the edge of the ship's viewing deck, gazing out at the endless stretch of stars, her thoughts tangled in a web of fear and uncertainty. Even here, aboard this human's vessel free from the auction, Block and the leering eyes of her captors, she still felt the weight of invisible chains around her wrists. Kael had saved her. That much was undeniable. But he had also done something else. Something she could feel deep inside her body, like a whisper of static under her skin. She wasn't sure what it was, but something had changed. A quiet hum of movement broke her thoughts. She turned slightly, catching the sight of Kael stepping toward her. His presence was solid, unwavering, but he hesitated just enough that she knew he was being careful around her. "I thought you'd be asleep," he said. Zyara shook her head. "I don't sleep well in unfamiliar places." Kael leaned against the metal railing beside her, his gaze following hers to the star-speckled void beyond the glass. "You'll have to get used to it. We'll be moving a lot. At least until I figure out how to break your signature from their tracking systems." Her fingers curled into fists on her lap. "And if you can't?" His answer was immediate. "Then I'll fight anyone who comes for you." Zyara exhaled slowly, unsure. Why those words made something inside her tighten. "You talk like a soldier." "I was one. A long time ago." She studied his profile in the dim light, the sharp cut of his jaw, the quiet intensity in his expression. He had the air of a warrior, yes, but there was something more beneath. The surface, a controlled ferocity, like a blade kept in its sheath, waiting for the right moment to strike. "You risked your life for me," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. "You barely know me." Kael didn't look away from the stars. "I don't need to know you didn't deserve what they were going to do to you." Zyara swallowed. "And yet, you still claimed me." Kael went completely still. Her golden eyes flicked to him, watching the way his fingers flexed against the railing, the subtle tension that crept into his shoulders. She didn't know how she knew, but she felt it. The truth, pressing at the edges of her mind. She didn't remember bonding with anyone. There had been no ceremony, no ritual, no willing surrender of her essence. And yet, something inside her recognized him. Her body did. Her instincts whispered things she didn't understand. Things that made her skin burn whenever he was near. She turned fully to him. "What did you do to me, Kael?" His eyes flickered, but his face remained unreadable. "I saved your life." "That's not what I'm asking." She took a step closer, her voice sharpening. "Something is different. I feel it. My body feels it." Kael exhaled through his nose, looking away. He didn't answer. Zyara's pulse quickened. "Tell me." "The truth." For a long moment he didn't move. Then at last he turned to face her fully. "I had to make sure no one else could claim you," he said, voice low, unreadable. "I implanted a chip in you, a genetic blocker. It ensures that no other being in this universe can ever." Her hand struck him across the face before she even realized she had moved. Kael barely reacted. His jaw tightened, but he made no move to stop her. Zyara's whole body shook, fury and betrayal burning in her veins. "You marked me like a possession?" "It was to protect you," Kael said evenly, but there was something deeper in his voice, something guilty. "If I hadn't done it, the moment they recaptured you, they would have forced a bond. With someone who wouldn't have given you a choice. And you think this is a choice?" Her breath was ragged, her fists clenched. Kael took a slow step toward her. He didn't touch her. He didn't dare. But his voice was softer now, more deliberate. "If I had told you beforehand, would you have agreed?" The words struck her harder than his confession. Would she? Would she have taken the risk? Would she have chosen to trust him? She wanted to say no. She wanted to scream at him, to demand he undo what he had done. But the truth was, a cruel, insidious thing. She wasn't sure, because deep in her bones, despite her rage, despite her fear, something inside her didn't reject the bond, and that terrified her more than anything. "You had no right," she whispered, her voice raw. Kael's jaw tensed, and for the first time he looked regretful. "Maybe not. But I'd rather live with your hatred than let you be taken." Silence filled the space between them, thick and heavy. Zyara turned away, her hands trembling. She couldn't look at him, couldn't bear the way her heart was betraying her, the way it didn't recoil from him the way it should have. "Remove it," she said, her voice barely above a breath. Kael hesitated. "I can't," he admitted. "Not without killing you." She closed her eyes, her breath shaking. Trapped. Not in a cage, not in chains, but bound to the one person she had no choice but to trust. And she hated that a part of her didn't want to run from him. Zyara paced the length of the ship's quarters, her movements sharp, restless. Her mind was a storm, rage, fear, and something far more dangerous twisting through her thoughts. Kael leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching her without speaking. He had given her space, but the silence between them was suffocating. "You had no right," she muttered again, though she'd already said it. It didn't matter. It would never stop being true. "I know," Kael admitted. That made it worse. She whirled on him. "Do you? Do you really? Do you know what you've done?" Kael's face was unreadable, but his voice was steady. "I made sure no one could ever take you against your will. By taking away my own will?" Her breath was uneven, her fists clenched. "You didn't save me, Kael. You claimed me, just like them." His eyes darkened. "I am nothing like them," she almost laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "A cage is still a cage no matter how soft the bars." Kael's jaw tensed, but he said nothing. Zyara exhaled sharply, dragging her hands through her hair. She could still feel it, the chip inside her, the invisible tether that bound her to him, and no one else. She didn't even know how deep it went. Had it already changed her? Had it altered? Her instincts, her chemistry, the very essence of who she was. She needed answers. "Where is it?" she demanded. Kael hesitated. "Zyara! Where?" she snapped. "Where did you put it?" His hesitation told her everything. Her breath caught. A slow, sickening realization settled in her stomach. "Not just anywhere," she whispered. "You placed it somewhere, where no one else could override it." Kael's silence was confirmation enough. Her whole body flushed, not with embarrassment, but fury. It was strategic, of course. By implanting it deep within her most intimate area, no slaver, no warlord, no enemy could remove it. It was the only way to be sure. Her entire body was now biologically coded to reject anyone that wasn't him. She felt sick. "You had no right," she whispered again. Kael stepped closer, his voice low, rough. "You're right. I didn't." She shook her head, stepping away. "And now what?" What happens to me now? Am I supposed to just accept this? His eyes locked onto hers, something raw flickering in their depths. No, he said. You're supposed to survive. A silence stretched between them, heavy and thick. Kael let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand over his face. I won't force you into anything, Zyara. You have my word. She laughed, sharp and cold. You say that, and yet my own body won't let me be with anyone else. He didn't answer, because he couldn't. Zyara turned away, staring at the cold metal walls of the ship, at the endless void of space beyond the viewport. She felt like a prisoner in her own skin, but despite all of it, despite her rage, her fear, the overwhelming wrongness of what had been done, there was something else. Something far more dangerous. A pull, a whisper in her blood. Something primal and undeniable, something that made her body feel too aware of him, of his presence, of the fact that he was the only one who could touch her now. She hated it. She hated him. But she wasn't sure if she hated it enough, and that terrified her more than anything. The ship's alarms shattered the tense silence. Kael moved instantly, pushing past her to the control panel. His fingers danced over the interface, eyes narrowing. What is it? Zyara demanded. Kael's face darkened. A tracking signal. Someone just locked onto us. Her stomach dropped. They found me. Kael didn't answer. He didn't have to, because outside, through the viewport, a massive warship lurched out of hyperspace, its shadow swallowing the stars. The Draxian warlord had found them, and he wasn't here to negotiate. The ship shuddered violently as plasma rounds rained down from the enemy warship, illuminating the darkness of space with deadly flashes of red. Kael's hands flew over the control panel, his jaw tight with focus. They've locked weapons on us, he muttered. Shields are holding, but they won't last long. Zyara's pulse pounded in her ears as she gripped the edge of the console. Can we outrun them? Kael's fingers danced over the interface, trying to calculate an escape trajectory. The Revenant was fast, but the Draxian warship was a predator, built to chase, to capture, to consume. No chance, he said, his voice grim. We're going to have to fight. Zyara turned to him sharply. Fight? Against a Draxian? That's suicide. Kael glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Would you rather be taken back? Her breath hitched. No, she'd rather die. The thought chilled her, but it was true. She met his gaze. What's the plan? A small, sharp grin flickered across Kael's face. You ever fire a plasma turret before? Zyara's lips parted, stunned by the absurdity of the question. Are you seriously asking me that right now? Kael flipped a switch on the console. A set of turrets emerged from the sides of the ship, their targeting systems lighting up. He pointed toward the secondary station. You want a say in your own fate? Get on the guns, something inside Zyara snapped. Maybe it was the rage. Maybe it was the helplessness. Or maybe, just maybe, this was the first real choice she had been given in a long, long time. Without another word, she moved. The moment. Zyara slid into the gunnery seat, her fingers wrapped around the controls like they belonged there. The targeting display flickered to life, casting a neon glow over her skin. Kael's voice crackled through the ship's comms. They'll send fighters first, take them out before they can get close. Zyara's golden eyes narrowed. Outside, the Draxian warship lurched forward, and from its underbelly, a squadron of sleek insectoid fighters swarmed toward them. Predators, slavers, monsters. Zyara's hands moved with deadly precision. The first bolt of plasma tore through a fighter's hull, sending it spiraling into oblivion. Another swooped in low, trying to outmaneuver her, but Zyara was faster, her instincts razor-sharp, her movements exact. She wasn't afraid anymore. Another shot, another explosion. Kael's voice broke through the comms. Not bad, Princess, Zyara smirked despite herself. Shut up and fly, Commander. Kael let out a low chuckle before the ship banked hard, dodging a barrage of enemy fire. But the Draxians weren't done. A grating, monstrous voice crackled over the ship's frequency. "Voss!" Kael stiffened. Zyara knew instantly. He recognized the voice. The warlord himself was speaking. "You have something that belongs to me, human." Kael's knuckles whitened over the controls. "She was never yours to begin with." A low, guttural chuckle filled the comms. "Is that what she thinks?" Zyara's breath caught. This was personal. Kael's jaw tightened. "You're not taking her." The Draxian's voice darkened. "Then I will take you both." A massive surge of energy erupted from the warship, a tractor beam. The Revenant shook violently, caught in its invisible grasp. Zyara's heart pounded. "Kael, I see." "It!" he snapped, slamming his fists onto the controls. "Engines are fighting it, but we don't have enough." The ship jerked. The gravity of the Draxian warship pulled them closer. Zyara's pulse raced. She knew what this meant. If they were boarded, if the Draxians got their hands on her, they would force a bond. They would claim her in a way that even the genetic chip couldn't stop. And Kael would be executed. No. No. Her mind raced. There had to be a way. Her golden eyes flicked to the power reserves. The ship's plasma core was overloading from the tractor beam's force. If she could redirect that energy, channel it into the weapon system, it would be risky. It could kill them both. But if she did nothing, the alternative was worse. She made her decision. Her hands flew over the console. She rerouted every ounce of excess power to the main cannon, overcharging it beyond safety limits. "Zyara, what the hell are you—" "Trust me," she shouted. Kael didn't argue. The moment the system beeped green, Zyara fired. The main cannon erupted in a blinding surge, sending a massive pulse of energy straight into the tractor beam's core. The entire warship shuddered violently. The beam flickered. For a moment, Zyara thought she had failed. And then, the tractor beam collapsed. The Revenant lurched forward, free. Kael reacted instantly, throwing the engines into overdrive. The Draxians were left reeling as the Revenant tore away, vanishing into hyperspace. The moment they were safe, Zyara collapsed into her seat, her breath ragged. Kael turned sharply toward her, his expression unreadable. "You could have fried the whole ship." She smirked, chest still rising and falling. "Yeah, but I didn't." For a long moment he just stared at her. Then slowly, he let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Remind me never to underestimate." "You," he muttered. Zyara met his gaze, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt like she had a choice, like she wasn't just running, like she was fighting back. And maybe, just maybe, she wasn't doing it alone.